Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We are just giving a few extra minutes to allow for everyone to join, especially if there's any technical issues. But we're really glad you're able to join us here today. Feel free to settle in, and I'm just going to, because we've designed this as a meeting, a Zoom meeting, we do have an opportunity for people to speak towards the end. And so if you're able to just press mute on your mic until that point comes in the agenda, we'd appreciate that. So with some consideration given to everyone's time, we're going to get started. And I do want to thank you all so much for joining in today's webinar. We're really pleased to be able to gather here in this virtual space for this hour and discussing how to prioritize diversity and inclusion while advancing climate action. So my name is Brina Viebeck. I'm the Climate Change Program Manager with ICLEI Canada. And to begin today's conversation, we're going to provide a highlights review of some of the incredible conversations for an inclusive future that happened at this year's Livable Cities Forum in early October in Victoria, British Columbia. And then we will dive into ICLEI Canada's new resource, which is titled Equitable Climate Adaptation, Considerations for Local Governments, and that we'll be highlighting, and we are really pleased to be launching today. So today's webinar and the associated resource aim to both create a case for this approach, as well as offer some tangible, practical, actionable ideas and tools for partners in local government. So to begin our gathering today, we want to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge that ICLEI Canada's head office is located on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas and the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And I am honored to work, live, and play in the city of Thunder Bay, Ontario, which has been built on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, which includes the Ojibwe of Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robinson-Superior Treaty of 1850. ICLEI Canada's work happens across Turtle Island, and which has traditionally been and is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And just a few housekeeping notes. We're happy to welcome any questions during today's webinar in the Zoom chat, and we will look to discuss them in the later half of the call. If you have any technical issues, please message directly either myself or Meredith Baldwin on the call today, and we will do our best to help. And as I mentioned right off the top, if you're able to mute your mic until we're in the agenda period where we're all sharing, that would be much appreciated. All right, so whether you attended the 2022 Livable Cities Forum or not, we want to share a very brief highlights reel of this incredible event that took place. This year's forum was developed with a focus on how to integrate equity and inclusion into action on climate change mitigation and adaptation, hence why we're talking about it today. The 35 sessions were uniquely designed to go beyond presentation style delivery and included an interactive component on every single session. In valuing the in-person attendance of the 300 delegates, we focused on designing all forum elements as ones that could not have been delivered via a webinar. Workshops, sessions on the move, plenaries, and networking breaks provided engaging discussion opportunities and platforms and hands-on learning opportunities over the 3 days. As was presented in the plenaries, which you can now view online, the Livable Cities Forum explored the synergies that exist between complex climate issues facing our communities, and all of those through an equity lens. Unfortunately, due to illness, we were not able to offer our on-site live performance of Reno Dance and their interpretation of the forum themes. However, we are pleased to share a post-event condensed video recording of this moving piece, which they entitled Together We Rise. This performance involving movement and spoken word asks us questions such as, how do we lift our heads when we walk down the street to see one another? How do we open our hearts and minds to see each other in a new light? And how do we lift hope up through the cracks in our city? Throughout the event, presenters and delegates engaged with and enjoyed the outputs of our on-site graphic designer, which you can see created a beautiful piece of artwork. And this brought together key messages as well as moments into one space. Just a very few of the key messages that emerged and that will be included in the upcoming highlights report. And you can see some of them here that were included on that graphic design. Things that we heard were climate change is a people problem. Relationships take time and move at the speed of trust. You must first know how to listen, then know how to collaborate. It's all about the process and not the product. Partnerships and relationships with non-traditional partners are well worth the investment, and Indigenous knowledges can be integrated with science. One Livable Cities Forum delegate shared that we find ourselves in challenging times, but if we work together with open minds and open hearts, then there isn't a limit to what we can accomplish. Another delegate said of the forum, we are facing multiple wicked systemic challenges, and addressing them with an equity lens is essential. We encourage you to visit the Livable Cities Forum website, and especially next week, where we will have all of our content up and ready for you to view, including a highlights report, links to all the presentations as PDFs, speaker profiles, the graphic design images, video links, including the plenaries and the performance that I mentioned. And this website will remain available and active as an ongoing home to find out information about future Livable Cities forums. And so now turning from the quick recap on the LCF event, we're going to be looking at the Equitable Climate Adaptation Resource, Considerations for Local Governments. This resource was informed by many sources, and today we're pleased to have two such of those wonderful individuals who provided background to help us present today. So Helia Babazadeh from the city of Mississauga was interviewed as one of several representatives of municipal staff who work on climate change initiatives, and is also taking part in ICLEI's Advancing Adaptation Program. So we'll hear from Helia first on why equitable climate adaptation is important, why it is complex, and what are some of the municipal obstacles for integrating equity into climate adaptation. We'll then hear from Julius Lindsay, a representative of one of the equity-focused advocacy groups that were interviewed to inform this resource. Julius is the co-founder of the Black Environmental Alliance, and will discuss how the obstacles and complexity with equity and climate action can be managed, and some actionable ideas and ways to make progress. So we're honored to be on this learning journey with you, which is why we've allocated time later in this hour to hear from you on your own learnings and insights. It has been my pleasure to work on this equitable climate adaptation resource along with our friends at Urban Systems. And I mentioned Meredith Baldwin, who is here joining us today and who contributed to the writing of this resource. So thank you for joining us. And Meredith will also help to summarize some of our conversations at the end of our hour together. And with that, I'd like to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to introduce and welcome Helia to speak and share her municipal perspectives on this topic.
Great. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Rena, and your team for having me here. I will try to my best to summarize how we have been working on climate adaptation, both at a corporate and a community level, and to include equity and diversity within this topic. I just do want to give the biggest shout out to one of our colleagues, Uzma Shakir, who is on the call. And a lot of my learnings has been through conversations with her and seeing how we can further implement diversity and equity when it comes to the climate conversation, because climate change is quite a bit of a hard discussion, and really climate change is an issue that impacts everyone. However, as we all know, not all those impacts are felt equally by everyone. So those impacts are felt at a bigger intensity, especially by equity deserving groups. People that can make the impacts to change their lives. So sorry, I'm a bit nervous because this is like quite a bit of a topic to discuss, but just through climate adaptation and the work that the city has done, we do try to get out to the community and have the considerations of the different communities in mind. So first step is knowing who your community members are and how these community members are impacted by our changing climate. The solutions to climate adaptation are not one size fits all. So having an understanding of your audience and having the understanding of the audience's needs are the most important considerations at the very beginning. And this kind of does allow you to have to build the basis of what you are going to go to the community with and what types of asks you're going to require from the community. Like one example is just making climate education and information accessible to all. And this accessibility, it means meeting the community where they're at, because not everyone can necessarily access information at the times that we allocate as city staff from 9 to 5. Certain individuals access information later on just because based on this, the way that their schedule allows. And also providing different ways that people can provide their input into your programs and what you are trying to achieve as a municipality or as an organization. One great example that I can provide is through the urban agriculture strategy and process that we were working on. A great thing that our team was able to achieve was providing different ways that individuals can provide their input into this particular strategy. So looking for ways, whether it be through providing honorariums to individuals that will necessarily need it to make ends meet if they were to take time to provide their input, or providing them a way to call in to provide their input to this strategy, because that is a way that they can best communicate their needs to the municipality. One great thing about that particular project was also leveraging our community groups. That's one thing that I think is very important, because the community groups that are within your municipality or anywhere really know what the community needs better than a municipality may need, because they are the ones that are out with the community, are the ones that are conversing with individuals on the ground. So that really can help build on strategies that will make your community more adaptable to the impacts of our climate change, or of our changing climate. And yeah, climate adaptation is really like many programs, as I said, originally is not a one size fits all type of solution. Engagement really needs to go with the times and really needs to reflect the needs of each and every community and community member. So knowing that community member, knowing the audience helps so you can tailor the conversation to their needs. Also, one good thing to really remember is that, again, you do not have to do engagement alone. As a municipality, there are many amazing organizations, and they can help leverage what you are trying to implement within the community. So I hope that provided a bit of a perspective from a government level.
That's really, really great, Helia, and we appreciate what you've contributed today, as well as how you contributed to the development of this resource. I know we had several conversations about each of our learning processes along this journey, and the challenges that exist. And we're going to give the opportunity for everyone here who wants to participate later in here in today's call to talk about and share some of those challenges, as well as resources and initiatives that are helping. And with that, so thank you very much, Helia. That was really great, and we appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to welcome Julius, who I see has joined under my name. So Julius, I see that you're there, and thanks for joining us. So I'll welcome Julius Lindsay, is a director with Sustainable Communities and the David Suzuki Foundation, and also the co-founder of Black Environmentalists Alliance. And we're really thankful to have you here today, as you help contribute towards the development of this resource as well. And we'd love to hear your perspectives on overcoming some of these challenges in aligning equity and climate adaptation and climate action, and your perspective. So I hand it over to you. And again, I'll just remind everyone, if you have questions that come up, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll also have an opportunity to discuss them towards the end.
Thanks, Rena. Yeah, my computer's doing some weird things with Zoom today, which I think is pretty normal. But yeah, thanks also for having me, and shout out to Helia. She said some of the things that I was going to say, so I don't have to repeat them. I'm glad I was here to hear what she said. But just a little bit of background about me for those who don't know me. As Rena said, I'm the director of Sustainable Communities of the David Suzuki Foundation, and I'm also co-founder of the Black Environmentalist Alliance. I've been at the David Suzuki Foundation for only about a year, and I actually Helia and I worked together in Mississauga. I worked in Mississauga for 6 years, and I worked for the city of Richmond Hill for 3 years, leading the development of both of their climate change action plan. And so I have like a pretty deep background in not only the sort of climate and climate science side, but also the community engagement side. And what I wanted to sort of start by talking about today is a little bit around climate justice. And we're here talking about the connection between adaptation and equity. And from my point of view, climate justice is sort of part and parcel with the many other justice fights that are happening in the world today, including reconciliation, including racial justice, including gender justice. And we cannot sort of divorce those issues when we work on adaptation. And I think it's really important. And I mean, having spent 10 years in municipalities, I think I can confidently say that municipalities are pretty bad in that sort of justice area. And so I was really excited to engage with ICLEI and talk about this part of the work. Building off of something that Helia said, I really want to sort of highlight the fact that connecting with communities and not doing this on your own is a really important part of this work, and really important part of the resources that are highlighted in the ICLEI resource. And part of that is really starting before you need people. So going to people and asking for something when you want something from them is different than building a relationship with them and engaging with them when, and then down the road engaging them when you actually need something and building that trust. Because we have to sort of acknowledge the fact that especially for a resource like this, which is targeted municipalities, like the relationship between municipalities and governments in general, and some of the communities within our communities is not great, and there's a historical history of harm there. And so why would they engage? I remember reading an article about a program in Detroit where they had they were offering people trees. Like, you could get a tree planted in your yard, they would come and do it. It was free. Like, you didn't have to do anything other than say yes. And they had really low uptake. And they were like, why? Like, this is like $1,000 worth of value, and like a tree that people could have and put on their yards. And everybody would be cool with it. But then they actually went and talked to the community, and they found out there had been a history of cutting down those trees so the police could surveil those neighborhoods better and have better sight lines into the housing. And so people saw this program as just another way to be invasive in their lives. And so understanding that is really important. I think another part of that is sort of identifying those communities. Even in the resource, I think that there wasn't a lot said about identifying some of those communities and who are those communities that, who is at the table and who is not at the table when you're talking to people, when you are engaging with folks, who is at the table and who's not at the table. And that leads into that conversation that Helia started about, hearing from people, doing what they want to do, going to where they are, meeting them where they are at. Because if you understand, who's not at the table, who you need to engage, then you should start to understand how you can engage them from a place of where they're understanding, as a place from where you understand. Much public engagement in the municipal format starts from, well, here's what we need and here's what we think and here's all the technical information that we have. And Helia said it, that there's a deeper understanding of these communities out there than you in City Hall could ever have. I remember when we were doing the climate change plan in Richmond Hill, I had one of our community members, we had a community stakeholder panel that we were running with organizations and individuals from the community, and somebody came to me and was like, you have the utility, you have the gas utility, electricity utility, you have the airport, you have all these folks here, why am I here? And I'm like, you are an expert in living in Richmond Hill, you are an expert in the city, you bring that knowledge to our plan, which is important, especially from an adaptation perspective, about the local experiences and the local history of what's going on in the city, because the solutions need to come from that place. The last piece that I wanted to talk about, well, actually the second last piece that I wanted to talk about was really connected to how we be equitable in this transition. And I often use an example, tall buildings. I live in Toronto. I've worked in Toronto and in the surrounding areas a long time, and we have many sort of 50s buildings in this area. And so when we think about an adaptation perspective, like I like to use the building as sort of a community within the community. And how do we address that? When the power's out for extended period of time, water only gets pumped to the 10th floor. So how do we service water? How do people above the 10th floor get that sort of very fundamental need in their lives? Many of people, especially in Toronto and Toronto community housing buildings, many of the people who live in these buildings are over the age of 65, over the age of 75. So again, if power is out for an extended period of time, we have, major storm events. How are the people who are over 60, over 75, who may be disabled, who may have mobility issues, how are they going to transit up and down that building? If the power's out for a long time, how are they going to get food? How are they going to get water? How are they going to access, again, those fundamental needs? And so thinking about those vulnerable populations and thinking how to service those folks, your adaptation actions can end up improving and servicing everybody. And really, at the end of the day, it's those types of actions and those types of folks who are more vulnerable, who are going to be more susceptible to the risks that may take a risk that you assess at a 3 to a 5 because they have exacerbating issues. And part of that, another reason why I use that building example is really around connecting this issue to other issues. And especially on the climate adaptation side, there's an opportunity to connect climate issues, climate adaptation issues to other social issues that are going on in our communities. And the one that I often use is that, I've done some back of the napkin calculations in Toronto, and there are some correlations between the summer temperature and shootings in Toronto. And so the higher the summer temperature, the more violence there is in the city. And when you think about a building, especially in Toronto, where many of these buildings have low-income people living in them, many of these buildings have no air conditioning. And so people who are more disposed to crime or who may be already undertaking crime, if they're not sleeping at night, it's 20 degrees in the nighttime, they're more irritable, they may be more likely to be violent. And so when we look at that, then fighting crime in our city becomes a risk from climate. And so many of these other issues are exacerbated by climate, and we want to draw those connections because addressing them will address many of the risks that we have identified in our communities. there was one other point that I was going to cover, which I have lost. And so, yeah, I will stop there. I think I've given a pretty good overview of some of the concepts and ideas to actually build equity into climate action and climate adaptation.
That's really great. And if you end up remembering, Julius, feel free to jump in. But I love how you gave some really tangible examples of what climate adaptation looks like and how it could really prioritize equity. I also loved your example, or your not example, but focus on building relationships, not just when you need something from someone or a community. I've heard this before where it's there's value in going out for coffee with your stakeholders outside of a project timeline. And I think you sort of alluded to that. So that's great. Thank you, Julius, for not only contributions today, but again, to this resource. And I'm going to now dive back into sharing my screen and providing a little bit more detail on what is in this resource that we're really proud to share with you today. And again, feel free to put questions or comments into the chat, and we'll also get to those towards the end. So despite the strong economic case for investing in climate adaptation, especially at a time when our communities are experiencing increasing and worsening climate events, public funds are and continue to be limited. So given the accelerating changes in our climate and the multi-billion-dollar loss events that we've recently experienced, we really need a whole of society approach. This includes private investors, professional engineering and solution designers, innovative building and community project delivery mechanisms. And we believe this is all needed to achieve the scale and speed of change required. And this climate action needs to be taken while prioritizing equity, diversity, and inclusion. And as Julius alluded to, it's also going to address many of the other social and community issues that we may be experiencing. So hence we've created this new resource designed to be as practical as possible. And it's intended to address the barriers preventing local governments from taking action to support climate adaptation in a way that centers equity and community engagement. So the resource will both create the case for this approach, as well as offer a toolkit of tangible, actionable ideas for partners and local government. So as we mentioned, this resource was developed by ICLEI Canada in partnership with Urban Systems and informed by numerous individuals to create this exciting new equity resource. In recognizing that this resource just covers the tip of the iceberg on a range of important topics, additional resources have also been included throughout the document, as well as in the last section, and they suggest next steps for further learning for all of us. So the purpose of this resource, and I'm sure a lot of you saw that the definition within the Zoom invite for today's webinar, but it's really threefold, which is to help understand and address primary barriers preventing municipalities from centering equity and climate adaptation. Secondly, to provide replicable and inspiring case studies of local governments and partnerships that have had relevant success, and to highlight tangible and applicable tools for centering equity and engagement in adaptation efforts. So we feel that this resource is really achieving all three of these purposes as a start. And we encourage you to use this resource to continue your learning as you move forward. So this resource is intended to provide a high-level look at the ways in which it is essential for equity to be centered in climate adaptation. And we do this via examples and promising practices, as I mentioned, such as the spotlights, And what it's not intended to be, I think, is also an important conversation. We definitely did not design it to be a prescriptive guide for how to engage with individuals or communities on climate adaptation. Each person in each community is different. And while we can learn from examples, individual needs, historic and present barriers, and inequalities will look different from one community to the next. And I know, Helia, you talked about this as well, engaging directly with those communities and working with where they're at. It's also not an all-encompassing resource in terms of who to engage with and what climate adaptation projects should entail. I think that we decided that level of detail was too prescriptive, and we wanted to leave that open for each community. Also, it is not a comprehensive guide to equity-focused engagement practices. There are a wealth of resources out there, and we encourage you to spend some time in reviewing these processes to improve your own engagement with equity-deserving groups. So the resource includes 4 sections that provide different foundations for taking on equity-centered climate adaptation. So the 4 sections, we start with an about this resource. We then dive into foundations for centering equity, then considerations by project type, and I'm going to get into a little more detail on each of these, and finally with additional resources at the end. So a little more information on each of these 4 sections. The foundations for centering equity. This section sets the stage for presenting foundational information and tools that are worth considering across project types. So this includes the history and context about systems we're working within, examples of privilege and inequity, building the case for equity in climate adaptation, and foundational considerations for partnership and engagement. Throughout this resource, you will find consideration checklists. And we thought these considerations, and hence the term consideration right within the title of this document, were really critical as they offer reflections to spark change in processes by posing questions that may be forgotten in typical project delivery. So there are 3 tools within this section that can be used to support better and more ethical engagement and partnerships. So within the Foundations chapter, we have included the Wheel of Power and Privilege, which you may have seen before. It's one tool that's included here to help identify how you, as well as people in the community that you're working with, experience different privileges and inequities. So this can include access to municipal services and impacts of climate change. And you can take a quick look at it here. This wheel can be used while considering the impacts of climate change, and that those inequities will be compounded with the effects of climate change, putting certain groups at greater risk. So now we're looking at the second section of the resource, and this addresses examples and considerations that are specific to different types of projects. So we've grouped those into 3 kinds of projects: adaptation infrastructure projects, adaptation plans and policies, and adaptation programs or programming. Each project type section will include project type description and some examples, as well as some common phases or steps. You'll then find some really excellent spotlights, and these are examples or more detailed examples of projects that use promising practices to center equity in climate adaptation initiatives. And finally, you'll also see the consideration checklists, and these offer questions for each phase of that project type that you're working within. So considerations rather than prescriptive actions acknowledge that every project and every community is unique, and that equity-focused actions are not one size fits all. So the considerations were compiled based on interviews with individuals and groups that either work with members of equity-deserving groups or underrepresented groups, as well as from local governments, and as well as through resources that were cited throughout our document. Shown here are the common project phases that we've identified for an adaptation infrastructure project type, and as well as some considerations for step 1 of this project type, which you can see pulled out in this box. So I highly encourage you to dive into this section of the resource and keep it handy as you work through the many stages of the climate adaptation work that you are doing and the types of projects that you're doing. And finally, the last section, as I mentioned, highlights additional resources in addition to those that are also linked throughout the guide. The references are grouped by subject, and so they're a great place to either start or continue your learning journey, which we are all on. I'll just highlight 2 such examples, one of which being a book that I just finished, I think 2 days ago, which is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wallkimmerer. And we've grouped this under our resources under the topic of cultivate hope and evoke cultural change within government institutions. And I'll also highlight ASAP's Living Guide to the Principles for Climate Change Adaptation. And this is a way in which you can take action on climate adaptation while also using equity. And so with that, I'm going to maybe stop sharing my screen at this moment and take the opportunity to offer up this space as a safe space, a positive framed face, and a future space and a future focused space that can have conversations about perhaps some of the challenges that you're experiencing in integrating equity into climate action, as well as potentially how it could also be some examples that are out there and that you might want to share that are working well. And I also encourage additional resources to be shared either by raising your hand and sharing and unmuting, or type it into the conversation via the chat. So maybe as we dive in, I'll just ask Meredith, were there any questions that came up in the chat that we should address first?
I haven't seen any so far.
Okay, that's fine. And so I welcome anyone to share their own experiences for discussion. And we want to hear from you because we are all learning through this process. And we know that many of you have experiences and expertise in your own areas. So if you'd like to share, feel free to raise a virtual or literal hand, or type it into the chat. And maybe to help prompt, I'll start with one question, and feel free to type this into the chat if that's more comfortable. Why do you feel equity is so important within climate adaptation? So a moment to reflect on this question and where you're feeling, and perhaps even why you showed up for today's conversation and today's workshop.
If I may say something.
Yeah, Uzma, thanks for.
Yes,
Go ahead.
I'm Uzma Shakir. I'm from city of Mississauga, both as a resident as well as I work for the city. See, to me, climate change and without equity makes no sense at all, because even if you look at it at a global level, you know, all the developing countries are feeling the consequences of other people's actions at a global level. It happens at a local level too. I mean, people who are already vulnerable are going to feel the impacts of climate change much more so than anybody else, and their capacity and ability to be able to adapt to it and change and find solutions to it is going to be that much, is reduced. So to me, it's a no-brainer. I mean, to me, there's no point in us hugging trees if everybody's going to die. I mean, this is about environmental justice. This is about creating an equitable and just society. It's not about, oh, because the poor people have always suffered the consequences of actions that other people have taken. Racialized people have suffered the consequences of what actions that other people have taken. And when it comes to the developing countries, getting all high on the high moral ground and on climate change, they look at the developing countries and say all kinds of stuff to them. Oh, you shouldn't be doing this and you shouldn't be doing that. But their industrialization and development took place without any consideration for any of the climate consequences that we are facing right now. So I don't want to see that replicated locally if you don't pay attention to equity, then this is going to happen. Oh, this is already happening. Hang on a second, what am I saying? This is already happening. And so to me, the two go hand in hand, or it's irrelevant. If we are dead at the end of this whole thing in any case, what difference does it make whether we are resilient or not? The idea is to survive and survive well, I'm assuming. So
thank you for sharing, Uzma, and that was really well shared and I think appreciated by many. Thank you for sharing, and I encourage others to feed off of that passion and that importance. I see even in the chat here, Christina has shared, because climate change doesn't affect everyone the same. So the least lucky portion of the population are the ones affected the most. And I think, perhaps the start of our journey along understanding and integrating equity often starts with understanding our own places of privilege. Now, I just wanted to jump back in here, offer someone else the opportunity if they wanted to unmute. We'd love to hear from you. I know although we can call it a safe space, it can be still a daunting space when there's many on a call, but we're all here learning. Just tying this resource in with the Livable Cities Forum, we did a soft launch of the resource at that event. And we did so by having a conversation where we wanted to hear from many and from all, because we are all experiencing the desire to integrate equity more, but also the challenges, especially within our local governments or partners within local governments.
There is a question in the chat about how to integrate gender equity and inclusion into international climate adaptation work.
Yeah, and I see, I think it's important to hear from those that are on the call to hear any suggestions that you may have. I will just quickly point out that within the document, especially within the first section on foundational considerations, there's some really broad level considerations on how to integrate everyone equitably in a procedural way, in a structural way, in a distributional way. And I'll just read out one example here that's listed. And then if Julius, Helia, or others want to respond as well, I'll welcome you to do so. But within the procedural consideration, creating fair, transparent, and inclusive processes for developing and implementing any program, plan, or policy, and increasing the engagement opportunities for communities to engage, especially if they are more impacted by climate change. So I think this responds to the question very broadly, and that's a little bit on purpose because we're wanting to not be prescriptive. I think it comes down to being open to understanding those that you're connecting with in your community, as well as offering the space to do so. Julius, Helia, or others, would you like to also respond to this It's a valuable question.
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one since you went already. I didn't want to be the first one to speak, but I think part of it is sort of understanding, I think you said this and a few people have said this, understanding that disproportionate impact, particularly on women, that the climate crisis will have. I also think we need to understand that when we're talking about the actual work that we're doing, whether it's community engagement or whether it's the actual implementation of actions that we are thinking about, as I said earlier, and as Talia said earlier, like who's at the table and who's not at the table. I always use the example that like I spent 10 years working in cities and I've never attended a city engagement process that I was not running myself. And I understand why you should be there, I understand the value of the voice, but like I got 2 kids, I have a job, I have a nonprofit I'm running on the side, I got other things that I'm doing, like I'm busy. And so and there's been a lot of talk and a lot of research done about during the pandemic, sort of the disproportional impact that the pandemic had, particularly on women from a job standpoint, from a child rearing standpoint, from a household management standpoint. And so when we take all those things into account, if we're undertaking climate adaptation is supposed to be for everybody to adapt. But if we're not thinking about how these things specifically impact various groups and individuals, then we're not making sure that everybody is adapting. The example on the mitigation side I often like to use is, we talk about electric vehicles, and electric vehicles are usually seen as like one of the solutions that we want to implement. And the paradigm, I was just having this conversation with somebody yesterday on their climate plan. The paradigm for electric vehicles is that we need to charge at home. What about people who don't own their home and can't have no way to put a charger in their home? What about the people who can't afford to put a charger in the home that they might own? What about the people whose car is their home? Like, if we're building a paradigm for people who own electric vehicles now, we're largely building a paradigm for people who own Teslas and own their own home and can afford to put a charging station in their house. And that's not the kind of paradigm that we should be building. We should be building a paradigm that services others and goes beyond sort of the majority of people who own cars now. And so when we're building solutions, we have to think about who is included in those solutions, who are those solutions servicing, and who are those solutions not servicing. And I think there are particular ways in which, especially during the pandemic, has shown us that women are uniquely impacted by these kind of crises, and that we should build those into the way that we think about and build solutions. That's it for me.
Yeah, that's great. And it's really building on the necessity around climate change action that includes engagement, that includes meaningful engagement and going beyond the base level and doing what we can to engage those that may not typically be heard. Helly, I wanted to just provide you the opportunity if you wanted to add anything there.
I think Julius has covered the majority of it, but I think the importance of, much like this guide that you have provided, I think just climate adaptation cannot be prescriptive as well. It is just dependent on the communities that you are trying to reach and engaging with them at their level. And providing a platform, I think the platform is the most important one, providing the platform, but then also engaging individuals on how they can utilize the platform to best meet their needs and advocating for themselves. Because without their advocacy, then we can't necessarily make the changes that we need to meet the needs that they have within their communities. So I think even educating individuals on the importance of advocating for themselves and their needs. And right now, I think even throughout the pandemic, there's been a lot of great global movements that have been happening that not only educate us, but also showcase the impacts of advocacy and what we can do as a global collective together.
Mm-hmm. I also just want to highlight, Helly, that we have talked about, and you highlighted the food strategy that Mississauga has put together, and how that engagement process, in order to inform that strategy, which is one element of building climate resiliency, how it went to those stakeholders to hear from all the different individuals. Do you want to maybe share some of those tangible examples?
For sure. So I will just like to shout out our amazing consultants, Hoffman Hayes, because without them, then the strategy would not be where it is. It was obviously a collaborative effort, but what we were able to do in consultation with Hoffman Hayes was providing a place for individuals to provide their feedback, but meeting them where they're at. So contacting those specific stakeholders that we do want to engage with and asking them when is the best time for you to provide your input on this particular program. So not necessarily telling them what we want to hear, but just allowing them a space to tell us what they want to tell us. And then also providing different initiatives for them to provide feedback. So we did, again, because it was during COVID time, a lot of things had to be done in a virtual setting. And again, you know, considering equity within this, what our team did was contact the library and put laptops and hotspots on hold for individuals that might not necessarily have access to such technology. So there's a lot of considerations that go into making these the urban agriculture strategy engagement accessible to all individuals with different needs. And we were also able to, one great thing that I thought was amazing that the team did was when we were looking for input on the actual urban agriculture strategy, we worked with our team at 311 and individuals were able to actually just call in and just say their points and what they want to see and the strategy go, or if they had any points of feedback, which I think was another great way for people to provide their perspective.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that, and a great example. I also wanted to highlight within the document that we're launching today, it is separated by project type and also by project phase. And this is very much going back to some of the things that have been mentioned, that pre-project engagement is often very crucial in building relationships. And building those relationships will then garner engaging those equity deserving groups in a way that you can plan for throughout. So once it's been initiated, and then not leaving them behind, keeping them resourced, informed, and participating so that it's a collaborative process as much as possible. Just considering time, I want to make sure we also address this other question that's come in through Christina. And it's a great question, having this conversation around those few that still have denial around climate change. And I'll maybe quickly provide my response, but I'd love to hear others because I know I see many familiar names on here that would probably have some great input as well. But that climate change adaptation and resilience is often building upon multi-solving many complex issues. And those can be housing, those can be energy, those can be food systems. And so if there are stakeholders who don't feel comfortable with the terms around climate change, it doesn't mean that a conversation can't happen. Where are they feeling, experiencing, seeing impacts of climate change, and where do they need or feel that there should be or could be some improvements? Yeah, so I want to throw that out to the community here.
I did want to make one point in regards to having the conversation about climate change with the climate deniers is one thing that I personally like to do is having the climate conversation without necessarily having the climate conversation. Because again, at the end of the day, every individual is passionate about one thing. So learning about their passion, making that personal connection and turning that passion into climate action without them necessarily realizing what it's all about. One great example of that is that, again, through the climate change escape room that we did, that was one way we were able to engage with an audience that might have not necessarily engaged with us on the topic of climate change. Through solving puzzles that were within that room, they were subconsciously, they were having fun and subconsciously learning about ways that they can actually make a difference. Like my friends in particular, to this day still, even though they're joking about it, it's still something that they've learned about the fact that reducing your thermostat by 1.5 degrees can make an impact on your energy bill and on reducing energy emissions. Sorry. So yeah.
I think that's a great point. Just making it fun is just one barrier that we can overcome to engage additional groups of people in different communities. We all want something that's fun. There's also many other barriers that can be considered when planning for engagement so that everyone can be heard and participate. So I'll give just I'll maybe consideration of time here. I will pass it over to Meredith, who has been listening to this conversation and, as I mentioned, also contributed to the development of this resource, just to give some summarizing final thoughts before we wrap up here today.
Definitely. I think that we had a lot of great conversation that both builds on some of the content in the guides and that I'm excited to see kind of starting these conversations with that as a foundation, because the resource definitely wasn't intended to catch all of the content and cover everything that could be said on this topic. I think it was really meant to be a foundation of sorts. And I know we had some great conversation here, I guess, starting around the importance of equity and having that understanding within us all about how equity denied groups face the effects of climate change significantly more, are contributing less, and in many cases are denied the amount of power needed to address and react to the effects of climate change. We had some good discussions around climate and gender equity, and more broadly, I think, climate and other intersecting barriers that people are facing. Julius shared some good thoughts around understanding the disproportionate impacts that the climate crisis has on different individuals and different communities. And then we had some good conversations rounding it off about the importance of taking non-prescriptive actions and really considering the uniqueness of each individual and community and situation. And Helia spoke to the importance of providing this platform and opportunities for advocacy, and then shared some of the kind of useful, to me, the really interesting level of detail that you need to consider to make engagement accessible to the people that you're working with in regards to the urban agriculture strategy. So I think that covers a little bit of what we talked about, and hopefully this leads to more conversations.
Yeah, I'll definitely build on that this is the beginning or a continued conversation that we hope to continue with you, as well as encourage you to continue it amongst your colleagues, friends, families. So thank you to all of you, especially those who presented and contributed to this resource today. And thank you to those who showed up today to learn and discuss. We encourage you to head over to the ICLEI website, where you can find and download the brand new resource on equitable climate adaptation, considerations for local governments. And also over to the Livable Cities Forum website, which, as I mentioned, will have lots of resources highlighting what occurred at that really great event. And as always, stay connected with us. You can sign up for ICLEI's newsletter, follow us on social media, and you can always reach out to us directly. So thank you again for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.